It's so inspiring to me, and I hope it is inspiring to every American, particularly those in positions to make decisions, because we have to continue, and I would even argue increase the military support that we give the Ukrainians sooner.
That was former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on Morning Joe this past Friday after being asked about her sentiments on the Russia-Ukraine war.
There's still much discourse over how much support, if any, the United States should still be giving to the war-torn nation. But Max Abrahms, an international relations professor at Northeastern University, opines in a new piece in The Atlantic that the U.S. is making a big mistake in Ukraine and that our support may actually be harming Ukrainians themselves. Here to discuss his brave piece on the U.S. strategy in Ukraine and its missteps is Max Abrahms himself. Welcome, Max. Thank you so much for joining us and for this great piece.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. It's unusual to get airtime, to raise any, hesitations about U.S. policy. In my lifetime, I believe this is the most propagandized war that we've seen. And that includes the Iraq war, that includes Libya, that includes Syria. I would say almost all U.S. wars have featured a large dose of propaganda. But in the Ukraine case, it's actually noteworthy because the stakes are higher. We're dealing with a nuclear-armed country. In fact, Russia has more nukes than the United States does. And the propaganda is widespread. So with the Iraq war, it was very top-down. It was a handful of guys, essentially, in the Bush administration talking about the axis of evil, linking Saddam with WMDs and Al-Qaeda affiliates, and other people sort of repeated it down the line. But with the Ukraine war, it's much more widespread. There are more propagandists, if you will, and it's not just from the United States, it's also coming from Europe. And so the goal of my piece was to sort of reconcile those talking points with the academic literature in international relations, which I believe urges more caution. I would like to make an acknowledgement, and that is that the field of international relations is quite rich, and there are many different theories and empirical studies to draw upon. And I don't mean to suggest that all of them are in the same direction, pointing to caution. But I do believe that the most relevant works suggest that the United States might want to reconsider some of its policies towards Ukraine.
Yeah, I wanted to read a paragraph from your brilliant piece. Everyone should read it. You write that states are significantly more likely to escalate against civilians as they become more desperate. Contrary to conventional wisdom, scholarship suggests Ukrainian citizens may paradoxically benefit from us supporting them less. Now, I wanted to ask you, first of all, to expound on that, but also, what is your explanation for why this is the most propagandized war in American history, and why the left, which is traditionally used to be the anti-war party, has gone, whole hog in on this war?
Right. I think that Americans often think of, the Democrats and the left as the same. They think of the Democratic Party as more progressive, more likely to put the halt on war. And yet we're actually not seeing that. Polls show that there is generally, strong bipartisan support for this war. But if anything, it's actually stronger on the Democratic side. And we saw this several months ago when there was a letter by some of the supposed progressives among the Democrats in Congress asking for at least contemplating negotiations, and it was shot down by the Democratic Party. It's a complex answer as to why the Democratic Party has abandoned, progressive interests when it comes to U.S. foreign policy towards Russia. But I do believe that it relates to the 2016 election, where Russia was essentially blamed for, the presidency of Donald Trump, who's reviled. And ever since then, Democrats have been baying for blood. And one way that Democrats have tried to distinguish themselves from the MAGA types is being tough on Russia. And so with the election of Biden, this created an opportunity for Democrats to not only stick it to Russia, but also to try to differentiate themselves from Trump and his supporters.
It's interesting, too, because although in our lifetimes, in recent years, over the course of the Bush administration, the aughts, the Republican Party was strongly identified with neoconservatism, with foreign policy interventionism. On a much larger historical scale, and of course, the parties have reversed what they think about a lot of things. They've switched in a lot of ways, but Vietnam was a war that was largely conducted by Democratic administrations. Korea was started by a Democratic president, ended by a Republican president. To the extent that there was any opposition to World War I and World War II, it was actually more concentrated in the Republican Party than the Democratic Party, and so on and so forth. So there actually has been a rich history of like fringe Republican opposition to wars that I think has now that we've returned to some degree.
I agree with that. That's a very astute observation. But I do think that in the American mind, the Democratic Party is more associated, ever since, the Vietnam War and the hippies and the protests. To an extent, we are seeing a reversal where the strongest sort of opposition to the war seems to be concentrated in the Republican Party. But again, a lot of it does return to the American polity 2016 and beyond, where an important segment of the Republican Party, as you know, the so-called never Trumpers, they tended to move to the Democratic Party. Now, they might not say that they're Democrats, but they functionally are if you see what they write about in places like The Atlantic or Washington Post. Those people often, in general, have been quite hawkish, right? Many of them were neocons, and they were absorbed within the Democratic Party and moved it in a more hawkish direction. And it'll be interesting to see whether the hawkishness remains only for Russia or whether it extends more broadly, making the Democratic Party overall more hawkish, even on non-Russia related issues. We'll see about that.
Well, President Biden has said over and over again that the U.S. will stand with Ukraine for, quote, as long as it takes. But reporting in Politico signals that ironclad unity between Washington and Kyiv appear to be starting to crack. What do you think about this? Do you see any signs that the administration is growing frustrated with this kind of open-ended commitment? In public, they say Biden has reaffirmed over and over again, we are in this as long as it takes. Do you think that's true behind the scenes as well?
I think that this article is interesting. It's always interesting to read Politico. The reason why is because Politico has a very tight read on what's going on within the establishment. In some cases, they just reflexively parrot it. And so when they say this is what's going on in the establishment, you know that that actually is going on, or at the very least, this is what the establishment wants released to the general public. I think that the importance of that article is not so much in revealing that that the Biden administration is going to change its policy towards Ukraine, but I think that it highlights the disconnect between what people within the Biden administration and people like all of us actually know versus the public face of the administration in terms of its position towards Ukraine. There's a lot of sort of fantasy thinking about the Ukraine war. The idea is that we can just ramp up the amount of weapons to Ukraine and it'll achieve full victory. That Putin is going to say that, he made a mistake. He's going to withdraw his forces, including since 2014, that he's going to go home, that that we're not going to see him retaliate in any ways. That he's not going to retaliate against Ukrainians. He's not going to sponsor more cyber attacks or more terrorism, and that this will simply be a one-sided victory. But the likelihood of that happening, I think, is about zero. It's extraordinarily low. The truth is, and we're seeing this already now, is that this is a war of attrition. It is extremely bloody on both sides. No side is going to attain 100% victory, and this is going to become even more obvious when if the battle gets to Crimea, where Russia is even more dug in, and which means even more to Putin into Russian history. Putin says that Crimea is a red line, and I do not see the Russians leaving there lightly at all. And surely people within the Biden administration understand this. And so when they say, our goal is complete victory, it's simply unrealistic. It's not going to shake down that way. And as a professor, independent of any sort of policy prescription, I'm interested in the truth and sharing it, even if it leads to some messy and worrisome answers.
Well, Max, we so appreciate having your expertise on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
We'll have more Rising right after this.